Yes. It was mentioned, I don't know if you heard just now, this is the last class of Genesis. Not to fear, we will continue in the fall with a different subject, but we work through Genesis today. In just a few minutes, we'll get to chapter 45 and 50. Well, why not 46 through 49? Because if you read them, you'll know that a big chunk of it, or significant chunk, is genealogy and some other things. But the core of Genesis, which in fact is a new theology, as Aaron just pointed out to me, and an unexpected ending is there early on in chapter 45. Like what the whole book is about, or what the entire, at least Joseph narrative is about, is revealed. And we'll get to that. But I also want us to open up and think about through the whole book. So today is the last class of Genesis. And we have plans, Aaron and I, to do a series of things in the fall. And we want to see what your reaction is before we set that in stone. And we mentioned last time your new position, right? Yeah. Everybody knows about Aaron's new job. What?
It's a congregation in the North Hills, a congregation called Ohav Shalom, around Ross Park Mall, that neighborhood.
So it's the equivalent of being the rector at this congregation in the North Hills. Oh gosh, Aaron, does that mean you'll never come to Calvary anymore?
Hardly.
Hardly. We're stuck with him. I mean, what a blessing it is to have him here.
It's as God intended, right?
No matter what we try to do, this is what God intended. That, by the way, is the story of Genesis. His office will stay right there. He'll still be. Our Sunday's morning schedule might be a little different, but it's our intention, beginning in September sometime, that we have a class on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Do you want to pray, and then we'll talk about the potential subjects?
Sure. So we've begun each of our sessions with the following. We'll do the same on this last class. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank you, God, for providing us with texts that inspire us and giving us the opportunity, indeed the responsibility, to plumb them for meaning and there bring greater understanding and satisfaction to our lives. Amen.
So for a couple reasons, Aaron and I were looking at a slightly different approach. Still 10 a.m., still Sunday mornings, but with his job, he won't be here every Sunday. That's an impossibility. And to stay focused on what we're doing so we can break it up into smaller chunks. A lot of us are here every week, but I mean, very few people are here Sunday after Sunday. That we are proposing week 1, this is September 8th, doing an introduction to Jewish and Christian Bible, a little refresher as we approach all that. And then last year we looked at the parables of Jesus, if you remember that, and we used a book by a woman named Amy Jill Levine. She is an Orthodox Jew, and she is one of the best New Testament scholars in the world. She's at Vanderbilt University as a professor there, and she has written several different books that we would also utilize, like we did the parables. She has one on the Sermon on the Mount, which, what book is the Sermon on the Mount in the Bible? Anybody know? Matthew. Okay, good job, everybody. In Matthew, and it lays out some of the most important teaching of Jesus. But she offers this book from a Jewish perspective as well as a Christian perspective. Somebody requested that we study the book of Ruth. Anybody ever read the book of Ruth? I just got told the craziest story, and I don't know if I believe her. The only thing that Allison has ever won in her life is what?
A wild turkey.
A wild turkey at the state fair.
Michigan State Fair. My father had to get a string and was walking around with his turkey, and he looked down at it. Father was always very conscious of his chin, and he looked at this turkey and said, "I think we're related."
I want to believe that. I'm not sure if I do.
My father were here to tell you, but we found a very happy farmer to have
A happy farmer took it. If there is another book of the Bible that's short-ish, like 3 or 4 weeks, Ruth is 4 chapters, we would certainly be happy to look at that. Then as we get right into Advent, Amy Jo Levine has a great book on the season of Advent. What is something I specifically wanted to talk about that book addresses is, what is the Jewish understanding of Messiah? From the Christian perspective, that is an inherited concept that there is a Messiah, what we might call the Christ, the Anointed One, and we as Christians took it and adapted it. So our understanding of Messiah is not the same thing as a Jewish understanding. Why don't the Jews believe Jesus is the Messiah? I've been asked that about as much as any other question. That we look that and other things, some of the traditions we have. I mean, guess where a Jesse tree, an Advent custom, comes from? Who is Jesse?
David's father.
David's father. Oh, you mean yes, King David of the Jews. All this is mixed theology, mixed mythology is another way to think of that. And so what's the Christian part? What's the Jewish part? How did we interact with those? In the new year, that we would have in January another book of hers on the hard sayings of Jesus. Unless you hate your mother and father, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Does Jesus really mean you have to sell all your possessions, give it to the poor to enter the kingdom, or just 10%-ish after taxes? Those types of sayings that require something significant of us. And it would be 4 or 5 weeks on that. There's a wonderful book she has called The Misunderstood Jew, Understanding the Jewishness of Jesus, that we would look at. And then something that's particularly interesting to me is a book of hers on the Gospel of John that we do towards the end of the year. By that I mean March, April, right as we go into Holy Week. The Passion Gospel, the story in the book of John anyway, about Jesus' last days, his trial, his crucifixion, is the one that we sing on Good Friday. And the Gospel of John is the book of the Bible, is the one that says, the Jews, over and over. And so Aaron and Alan Lewis and I rewrote portions of that, what we sing, to make, in our opinion, convey the meaning, carry the freight by changing the language without compromising the theological integrity and keeping beautiful language still. Often I find the new translations are very clunky and not elegant and so on. To make it still that you can sing it, which is also a challenge, and make it part of a whole. Also to tease out 2 aspects in the gospel when it says the Jews. Sometimes it means the religious authorities, the bishops, the chief priests. Sometimes it means the mobs. And so trying to understand those 2 things. So looking at this gospel from a Jewish perspective and a Christian perspective through the lens of her book, with Aaron and I leading it, that's what we'd like to do right as we get into Holy Week. And then news, it might be a revelation to some. I've been here over 10 years. I have a sabbatical, so I'm trying to take it that would have the least impact on the negative impact on the congregation. That I would be gone the Sunday after Easter, which is, when is that? April 20th is Easter next year. So I'd be gone right after that. So that's when the class would end. Does that general approach sound okay to everybody? Yes? If there's any other book of the Bible, a shorter one, that you would like to discuss, email it to me or Aaron, and we'll try to include that. We're not, particularly the Ruth part, we're not wed to, but any other subject thing, we'd love to do that. Do you want to lead the summary of Genesis?
Oh.
I can do it.
Get us started.
I'll get us started. So we have been talking about, reflecting together on the book of Genesis. How many chapters is it total? 50. Excellent. And you remember, it feels like at least 2 different books to me. The first 11 chapters are what we might call cosmic history, like the big stories. And what does Genesis start with? What 2 stories that are directly related? The creation and then the other creation. And there's some, what else is in those early stories? Noah and the flood. There was Adam and Eve and that creation stuff going on. Begats is a little later, but yeah, that's in there. The big cosmic stories. And then it switches, feels rather abrupt in a way, to the story of one extended family. And it becomes a long narrative, or was it chapters 12 through 50, of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then we end with Joseph. Joseph is a pretty significant portion, but it's how God speaks to a specific people that were from an area, and they settled in Canaan, what we call also the Promised Land, in general, modern-day Israel and environs, and led them and then entered into a covenant with them. And we see how they went from what Aaron has often called monolatry, that there is one God among many, to just God. There's still this point of the story, it's still monolatry, right? That this is our God among many gods. And how that God asks certain things of people, commandments, which is think of that type of idea, that God enters into what we call a covenant relationship, which is not a transactional one. If you do A, I'll do B. No, we're married for better, for worse. I'm not leaving you, Israel, no matter how unfaithful you are. When you go worship other gods and melt down all your rings, gold, to make a golden calf idol, I'm really upset and cross with you. However, I'm still your God. That's a new idea in there as well. We go through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph is the next in line, so to speak, in this family to carry on the tradition. And he adds, or I should say added through him, more understanding of who this God is and who our people are and what the nature of that relationship is supposed to be. So a little earlier in the story, his brothers, Joseph's brothers, were probably jealous of him because why were the brothers jealous of Joseph? Joseph, who was not the oldest, he shouldn't have been the one in charge. Why were the brothers jealous of Joseph? He was daddy's favorite, exactly right. And he got all the nice stuff, including the really fancy coat, the dress, the sign of, oh my God, here comes that guy in his really nice coat of many colors because he's clearly dad's favorite, and look what we got, hand-me-downs. It's a direct visual reminder that he is dad's favorite and we are not. And what do they do to him? Oh, and he also has dreams. That stupid, idiot, no good dreamer who's dad's favorite. What do they do to him? They throw him in a cistern. At least it was dry. I mean, there's that. Then they sell him into slavery after they'd plotted to kill him. And then he's gone. And then, remember, to make it worse, they took this fancy coat, this symbol of Dad loves him more than me, dipped it in animals' blood. Oh, look, Dad. Oh, what do you think happened? Oh, my God, do you think a wild animal killed Joseph? That's terrible. Okay, the end. Let's move on with our lives. And then the story continues through Joseph. What happens to Joseph? He ends up in Egypt. He's in prison. Then somebody interprets dreams for a baker. Who's the other guy? I can't remember baker in the second person. Do you remember?
Cupbearer.
Cupbearer, thank you. And then they don't help him out. And later, oh gosh, Pharaoh, you're having dreams? I remember this guy who interprets dreams. And Joseph does, and they're the fat cows and the skinny cows. Remember, what was that a symbol of or metaphor for? Feast. 7 fat years, 7 famine years. The skinny cows eating the fat cows and so on. And he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man, is essentially presiding over the biggest empire of the time, or in that area. He's in charge. And then what happens? The famine comes, and who has to show up in Egypt looking for food? Just no matter how good a person you are, imagine seeing your brothers coming down the road when they sold you out as a slave after they threw you in the pit. Did they check if there was water in the cistern first? No. Story doesn't say so. We don't. But did they check before they threw him in?
Yes, because they knew it was dry. They went back to get him later. So they knew that he didn't drown. That was when Reuben said, you know what, guys, let's not kill him. Let's just rough him up a little bit. I'll go get him. And then he saw him missing from the cistern.
I will accept that as a plausible argument. I'm still not convinced that they all knew that he was not going to be dead when they did it. Or, how long can you survive in a pit by yourself? 4 days, maybe 3? So just imagine, you're like the nicest person on the block, but these brothers who threw you into the pit, who sold you into slavery, now come literally begging to show up because they're starving. And you happen to be in charge of the biggest country, and you also happen to be in charge of literally the grain production and distribution, more importantly. You're the one who decides who eats and who starves. And did Joseph, by the way, this is, some of it's in chapters 45 to 49, did Joseph give away all this food out of the goodness of his heart or Pharaoh's heart? No. Oh, you poor people, I'll be a man among you. And no, he sold it to them. So this would be wartime profiteering, kind of?
Price gouging.
Price gouging, at least. Because if you're not sure if it's price gouging, they gave all their money, and then after all their money, and then the next year, hey, we're still hungry. What? Wow, that must be really tough. You're hungry. What are you going to do? Well, how about if we sell you all our animals? Okay, thank you, done. They all go to Pharaoh. They come back the next year. Wow, we're really hungry this time still. Guess you got nothing to sell. How about we all give ourselves an indentured servitude to the Pharaoh, and then everything that we make from selling crops and what are animals and so on, the Pharaoh gets 20%. That is, so Pharaoh is liking all this. Everybody's essentially enslaved. And Joseph, so we don't call him a man of God, but that's the guy doing all this.
Yeah.
And then his brothers show up. What would you do in Joseph's position? Would you at least take a few moments to relish the beauty of this moment?
Can I jump in about what you would do at that moment? So let's trace for a moment Joseph's relationship with his brothers. In the beginning, when he's sharing his dreams that have the brothers or the 11 stars bowing down to him, and right, remember? The dreams were not just that he's telling them dreams, but the dreams actually forecast or suggest that Joseph imagines that one day he'll lord over them. And we know, omniscient readers that we are, that will come to be, but his brothers resent the intimation, and will even our father bow down to you, right? And they have enmity for him. If you look at 37:4, that's early in the story where Joseph and his brothers' relationship is described. They could not speak a friendly word to him. And then if you look on the page for chapter 45 here, at the very beginning, when he sees them, he weeps, verse 2, he weeps so loudly the Egyptians heard it, the house of Pharaoh heard it. It's always interesting to me when emotion is described in the text. We get few references to actual emotion. When God speaks to Abraham and says, take your son, your only son, the one whom you love. Or after Sarah's death, Isaac finds comfort with Rebekah, right? And so we get a sense of his grief being soothed a bit. When we have a suggestion of emotion, it's always an interesting opportunity to just appreciate the humanity of the individual, or to recognize the way in which our emotions resonate to another's. So we could talk about the role of emotion in public life. I was just thinking as I was highlighting this and thinking about this class, do you think of moments in public life where emotions have come to play such that we have a more favorable or a less favorable impression of this public figure? Can you think of an example? I have a couple in my mind.
Ed Muskie crying in New Hampshire.
That was the first one I thought of too. If you remember when Ed Muskie cried, right, in New Hampshire, or Maine, was it?
I think it was New Hampshire. He blamed snowflakes.
Okay, okay. Remember that story? How about another? Yes, when Hillary, in the 2016 election, right? She cries after Iowa, I think it is, and New Hampshire, and it made a big deal. It broke through with some people, and other people suggested that display of emotion is what women do, or is exactly why we shouldn't vote in that direction, or what have you. But much is made of the role of emotion, or the lack of emotion. We think of a defendant in a criminal trial who could be anybody, who doesn't seem to betray the emotions we would imagine would be appropriate when you come home and find your spouse dead, or when you, right, are accused of something that's really, and when someone shows no emotion, it's also sort of an interesting character trait, right? Okay, so in the beginning, Joseph and Joseph's brothers are not able to speak a kind word to him. And then if we look at the back of verse 14, 15, when he actually acknowledges to his brothers who he is to them, he falls upon Benjamin's neck and weeps, not unlike when Jacob and Esau greet each other, sort of a euphemism for a certain kind of embrace, or we talked about the risk involved, whether it's a kiss or whether it's a bite. And then at the bottom of 15, and after that his brothers talked to him. If we look at verse 50, verse 12, where is that? Over here. No, that's not the one I want. 50, verse 21, sorry. Have no fear, I will myself will provide for you and your little. In this way he reassured them and speaks kindly to them. So we move from their not being able to say a kind word to him to having presented himself to them when they present themselves to him, and he speaks with them. And then finally in chapter 20, verse 21 of chapter 50, he speaks kindly to them. So it's just sort of this evolution. You can imagine if you've had a relationship with a family member or a friend that's gone into great difficulty, and then you begin to work your way through that, or there's a rapprochement, or kind words are exchanged, or you got through it without ugly words being exchanged, right? And we slowly move back into, hopefully, a relationship where we can speak kindly to each other. So that's a particular insight. It's to trace the way in which Joseph and his brothers' interactions one-on-one or 1-on-11 are described. Right? Other thoughts or questions about that? The other unique piece of what happens here is that Joseph introduces, Jonathan made reference to this, a new theological paradigm for the Bible. It's a familiar paradigm for us. That is to say, something along the lines of God's plan, right? Or we look back on our life and say, well, that was intended for good. I couldn't see it at the time. I wouldn't have expected or never would have imagined that would actually be something that would turn out for the good. But there's a theological idea behind that with which we're all familiar. But up to this point in Genesis, we don't know of this theology. Or at least the people involved don't betray their own knowledge or their own understanding of that theology. Does everyone understand what the theology is? Do we want to just state it? What are we talking? What does Joseph introduce to his brothers when he says, a couple of different places where he says it. If we look on the page for chapter 45, starting with verse 5. Joseph says to his brothers, come closer. They come closer. He says, I'm your brother whom you sold into Egypt. That they're all familiar with, even if they don't recognize now the grown man who's standing in front of them. Then starting with verse 5, now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. In verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant of the earth. Verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. It wasn't you who threw me in the pit. It wasn't you who sold me into slavery. It wasn't Potiphar's wife who accused me of inappropriate behavior. It was God. Moving through these agents or these mysterious ways that we might not be able to recognize until after the fact. We see the footprints or the fingerprints, or then we realize. Yes?
This is the first time of that?
This is the first time this theology is introduced with, we might go back and say, well, Adam and Eve were thrown out from the garden, but that's part of God's plan. And if we're not such, well, then this wouldn't have happened. And we, the omniscient reader, or if you will, the omniscient theologian, recognizes, right? Because we know how the story plays out. But for someone within the story to suggest that God's plan is at work is a new idea. Yes?
There's nothing in the order of this culture, of this group of people, that would have made this narrative a likely outcome for Joseph. So it's so not a human plan.
So do you remember, thank you, do you remember, Jeffrey said, remember what Jeffrey said? That up till now, there's nothing to suggest that people were familiar with this idea. Yes? Yeah. Do you remember the book that came out, God, it could be 25 years ago, by Thomas Cahill called The Gift of the Jews? Do you remember this book? He had a series of them. I think The Gift of the Irish, what this particular population gave to the world. That was the gift, right? What this culture introduced, such that we now think about how things work in a different way. What Thomas Cahill suggests in this book, The Gift of the Jews, is what the Jewish people, or what Jewish tradition introduced to the world, was that time moves forward. And because actions have consequences, as time moves forward, we have an opportunity to get better at things. We can improve if time is in fact moving forward. But heretofore, according to Thomas Cahill, life was circular and everything repeated. And there wasn't a particular notion that what you do here redounds later in your life. It was cyclical. But if we believe that life moves forward, it may revolve like a wheel going forward, right? So that certain things repeat, but that we move ahead, that's a certain kind of gift. And with that idea, you can then introduce the concept that there's a divine agent, or there's God who's moving things forward, or determines the path, or the obstacles, or the learning that will be available to you as a result of the various challenges. But we, up until this, for the first 44 chapters of the book of Genesis, God has certain characteristics. God does certain things, and certain things follow from that. God creates the world, so God's able to make the natural laws that govern the world. Or God created you, and therefore, right, we may be in relationship. But the idea that God moves through the world in this way is novel.
Where's God been the whole Joseph narrative?
Well, we haven't seen much of God in the Joseph.
Where's God been the whole story of Joseph? In the background?
Wasn't he giving him his dreams?
The question is, was it not God who provided the dreams that Joseph relies upon? Arguably, we might say that, right? You want to say more about that, where God was?
Yeah, God seems, let's say at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, quite interactive. God comes walking with them in the cool of the garden. Okay. And then God is speaking directly to Abraham and some of these other characters. And with Joseph, God seems less of an agent and just removed from the situation. Yes, maybe speaking through dreams, but that's at least a step removed from where the type of interaction before. And in fact, I think one could make a case, the Joseph part of the story, which is a pretty big piece of Genesis, God is not active in the same way. And so it's starting to set up what happened to who's the main character of the Bible? Let me ask it that way. God. That's the quick answer, by the way. The main character of the Bible is God. So where's the main character for this big part of the story? And it becomes obvious when Jeffrey was saying, this is an unexpected ending. It's a twist ending that we don't see coming. God has been very directly active, in human form and in other ways, and then removed. Well, where did he go? Aha! And then you see this big reveal in 45. Well, in fact, Joseph tells us, this was God working in all these ways behind the scenes all the time, introducing this new way that the main character works. It's a really profound way of telling the story. Because, as I said, for a section, God doesn't seem present at all. And then Joseph tells us this is how that main character, the main actor, has been working all along. That's how we're supposed to look at it. And if God's been acting this way through my life, presumably God acts in similar ways through everybody's lives, even today. I would say that this concept, and Aaron was suggesting this, has become so ingrained, normalized, expected, that that's how God works. And in fact, God doesn't work ordinarily, or at least how we imagine it, in the ways presented in the Bible. Jesus walking on water, nobody expects that. Bread and wine multiplied, nope. God says, sacrifice your son, definitely not. God does these miraculous things like causing a flood or causing a plague, or no. But how God works is the way it's suggested in the end of Genesis. Am I wrong about that, or is that how most of us think? So imagine that the whole narrative so far has been alien to us, and what suddenly becomes familiar is at the very end, and in fact, a totally new idea. That to me is mind-blowing, how this all works together. Am I making this up, or am I in good rabbi grounding here?
I think you're good.
Okay, good. I was like, I'm just a Christian approaching this, but that seems right to me. Okay.
I think that's right.
Definitely also blame God for things that happened that really God didn't do, but that man did.
So don't we blame God for things that happened that God didn't really do that we did? The short answer is all the time throughout the whole history of the world. And there is, in fact, a technical term for this called theodicy. And that is, if there is a good God who is all-powerful, the creator and so on, and if this God is all-powerful and good and presumably also all-knowing, then why do bad things happen?
Like the Holocaust.
The Holocaust. There is, and there it breaks down this whole concept, or I should say, breaks up into different categories. There is a category of human interaction or intervention. Well, God didn't kill all those Jewish and other people, but other people did. So why did God allow that? And then there are the things we might call natural disasters or acts of God, a hurricane, a flood, a baby born with some heart failure or disease, or whatever the case may be. There's things that seem people did or a natural occurrence, and then there's crossover. And so why does God allow such things? That's the basic problem of theodicy. Jeffrey.
And in this, what Joseph is trying to get us to go with is that God can use even really ugly acts to accomplish God's end.
God can use really ugly acts to accomplish God's end. Great point. He is not a plant. Let me suggest, did anything happen on the hill at Calvary that was a horrible thing that God brought good out of? The crucifixion of Jesus. That's part of that whole story. This is much more of a Christian perspective, I think.
The crucifixion of Jesus? Yeah.
Definitely on the...
You're on pretty solid ground.
Solid ground. What I meant is that we believe more than whatever the average Jew is, than a Jewish theology, that's in fact often how God works, and that the root experience for Christians is the crucifixion resurrection, the death with new life from that. That's what made us into a new people, a new faith. The root experience, I'm getting this from my college professor 30 years ago. What is the event that created the Jewish people? Was it Abraham sacrificing Isaac? No, it's not even before with the flood. What is the event? It's Exodus. It's broken up different types of people, loosely interconnected, all enslaved in Egypt, and then they're led by Moses through the promised land, through the desert, which is probably where they become Jews, somewhere on the journey. And
Right.
then when they arrive, it's not like they're in the oven a long time, is one, still cooking, because it takes a while to get the Egypt out of your system. Like they make gods and they have this other stuff, and then they have to learn to be ready to enter the promised land. And that's the experience that makes them Jews, is the Exodus. Slavery to freedom. The Christian experience is death to resurrected life. Those are very closely related, but they're different things. And so our primary lens as Christians has been this death-resurrection motif. If you want to get really technical or broaden it even, you could add in, well, the images are dying person on a cross. Well, let me go back. A baby, dying person on a cross, empty tomb. Birth, death, new life. That's the Christian arc of narrative there. For Jews, it's slavery to freedom.
In creating the Jewish community, yes.
In creating the Jewish community. So these stories we look back on and interpret it this way, but this new idea to do either of those things, by the way, because my guess is when you're going through crucifixion, it's very bad. Or you're in slavery, it's very bad. Only later do you see, did God cause us to be slaves in Egypt? No. Did God cause Joseph to be thrown into the cistern, then sold into slavery, then end up in Egypt? And why were the Jews all in Egypt?
Because of the famine.
Because of the famine. And then later they become slaves. That's how they get there. So did God cause all these things? No, but God used all of them or worked through all of them. That's both a very Christian and very Jewish idea that emerges in this spot. Sandra?
So back to Judy's question about the Holocaust. So God used the Holocaust to do something good?
Did God use the Holocaust to do something good?
I have a great deal of problems wrapping my head around whether God caused that to do good, whether God allowed free will and all those evil people, starting with Hitler and all his people that were behind him, Eichmann and Goebbels and...
Yeah.
How did God allow that?
I never said God caused. I don't think God caused it.
But did he allow that to happen because there was good in the end?
Did God allow it to happen because there was good in the end? So here's a very hard thing to do. Separate those two ideas. God allowing something to happen and then to do good with it.
Or was he allowing man's free will?
I wouldn't say God allows it so then God could turn around and do this. I'm going to allow my kid to fall down so I can pick him back up. That's not a good way to approach things. It's unhelpful for everybody and not as revealed in the nature of God. In our tradition, I don't know what it says in Judaism, why would God allow such a thing? Is it the notion of free will?
Ultimately, this is a paradox that you put your finger on that we all sort of innately appreciate. Is everything that takes place in the world supposed to take place? Arguably, if it's part of God's plan, we can do no other than what we sense that we have free will. We ascribe to everyone else free will so that we can hold ourselves and others responsible for what we do. But if you take this idea that everything is part of God's plan, because it's possible, it's allowable. That's a very difficult, ultimately this theology becomes quite problematic, right? Everything then becomes justifiable because one day you'll see why this had to happen.
Yeah.
And therefore,
I think I would call that bad theology, or thinking about God in a way that's inconsistent with our tradition. What our tradition would say is that God created human beings to have free will. So this is not one big play where we're just simply doing the parts without a robot, without any agency. In fact, everybody has agency, whether they understand that or not, to interact with the world as an individual, as a group. And sometimes people do bad things. And by sometimes I mean the Christian tradition says everybody does bad things quite often. We call it sin. We go against the will of God. And that creates a gulf, is an old way of doing it, a gap, a separation. And then through prophets and teachers and so on and so forth, and ultimately through Jesus, that's how we're reunited back to God. Even though we continue to do these things. Because does God cause it? No. Does God allow it? No. Can God still work good through something stupid or evil that we've done? The answer from our perspective, our tradition would be yes. How does that happen? Usually through other people. Also exercising their agency, their free will is another word for that, to do good. So what good can come from the Holocaust, and I'm not trying to be political or partisan in any way, the Jews got their own state for the first time. Came directly as a result of that. Hopefully that it would never happen again. That there are certain things, it strengthened Jewish resolve, Jewish identity, among a variety of other things. Can other bad things could happen from that too. But I do think it comes back to having agency or free will to act on the world. Jeffrey keeps raising his hand.
To add to that list of things, it's also pain does a lot to get things to change.
Pain does a lot to get things to change. Yes, there's that.
And also, the way I thought about it for a long time, God isn't like somebody who's walking down the road and there's a fork in the road and then God decides to go this way. God doesn't see decisions like that. We see decisions like that. God's whole being is purposiveness. And so he's moving, or she is moving along, and there's this massive stuff going on, like a Cirque du Soleil that's going on everywhere, human freedom everywhere. Only this part has got like automatic weapons, and this part over here are people that really do want to try to save people, like doctors and soldiers and those, So God has to bring all of this along into that purpose. So it's not like, I'm going to decide, like a CEO might decide that this is going to happen, this is going to happen. God's purpose is the whole thought.
What's that? Say that again. God's purpose.
God's purpose
Is.
We as Christians.
Jeffrey comes from our monastic tradition, which, and I mean that in the best sense. So if you remember the Mary and Martha story, Martha's working all the time. Mary's like sits. I am absolutely Martha in the story. So how do I address anti-Semitism? Being mean to Jews or killing them is bad. I've never put a sign in my yard. I don't march. I don't campaign. I don't write letters. I would rather be friends with. Some of my best friends are Jews, right, Aaron?
true.
As it turns out. But rather than just say stuff like that, we invited Tree of Life into our home to be with us as our guest and later as our friends. And then we went to their temporary home to do weird things like a Purim spiel. And their groundbreaking, by the way, is in about a month, and I'm going to go to that to represent Calvary. And then later we invited Aaron to be here and teach it. So we work together, we live together as people who know each other. That's how we're trying to address this one issue. But way more than that, it's not just Aaron is a means to an end to fight anti-Semitism. No, he's my friend. He's also a minister on staff that preaches and teaches and does those things. He has value, that you're an inherently good person, that you have dignity and worth and so on. But that's what we do. That's how we're trying to, at least at this church, to live that out. And think of that with every different thing we do. Much time we have? Was it 9 years ago? When did the state of Pennsylvania Commonwealth first allow weddings for couples who are gay? 8 or 9 years ago?
Yeah.
Something like that.
10.
Years. I've been here just over 10 years. We had advocated that for a long time as a congregation. When it finally happened, as soon as the diocese allowed it, we did. Are we going to do gay weddings? Do you remember how we framed it? We're going to do gay weddings at Calvary. No. What do you mean? You anti-gay? I was like, I don't even know what that means. We're doing weddings, just like we've always done. Some of them will be for couples who are gay. Some of them are couples who are straight. As far as possible, it'll be the same service, the same readings and music and fees and preparation. It'll all be done with dignity and beauty. Oh yeah, that's right. No one complained. Oh my God, we're doing weddings for gay couples now? Not one person complained. Do you realize the drama that happened all over the Episcopal Church? Nothing. It was just the most natural thing that we just incorporate and integrate and be together rather than, did you all know how whatever progressive or conservative or whatever we are. We just did that. That's what we're trying to do, to exercise our free will. I've never framed it that way before, Judy.
I remember the first wedding that I came to of a gay couple. Looking around, and there weren't just gay people here for them. It makes me cry even to think about it. There were the gray-haired pillars of the women of the church, the old guard who were here, you know. It was just so beautiful.
Yeah.
I still think about it, and it still makes me cry.
That's, again, thank you, Judy. We're trying to be who we are and be as a living witness to the world.
You announced in the annual meeting, we just do weddings, and we all applauded.
Yeah.
Everybody did. It was, if you were met, some of you were there.
That's right.
I remember you speaking about it, and we all applauded.
Right. In this, in the last 7 minutes, in Genesis, is there anything, I'm curious, Aaron and I were talking about this, the last piece I mentioned of chapter 45, that God worked through these things, that's a new, profound revelation understanding. What surprised you in the book of Genesis? How relevant it is, how boring it is? The stories, how did that surprise you?
Well, they're so detailed, and they follow a stream of thought, and the development of faith. Before God was visible.
Yeah, there's a real development of faith. That's different aspects, like almost, like a little kid would grow up and he or she learns different things about the world.
And I think one of the things that's so wonderful about Joseph is he don't have to talk about his faith. It was. The reason that things happened to him was he ultimately believed that God would make things right.
That's an interesting point. Joseph ultimately believed that God would work things out. How did he get there? No one had that idea in the history of the world.
It's really interesting. It's very interesting. I was thinking, Alice, as you were speaking, that if we were to imagine, well, first of all, let me mention a book. There's a book called God, a Biography by Jack Miles. And he essentially takes the character, the protagonist, God, through the Bible. So God is creator in Genesis 1. God is lawgiver in Exodus. God is also redeemer, right, in Exodus, taking the Israelites out, and these various characteristics, and how God evolves or morphs or matures or changes over time is part and parcel of how we understand what the Bible suggests is God, who this character is. The idea that we may be cognizant that God is present with us in this moment, or God is my co-pilot, or right, all these different ideas about the relationship we have. The Bible typically, I'm thinking of when Moses asks to see God's face, and God says, "You can't see my face and live, but I'll secret you in this cleft of the rock, and you'll see me as I pass by, and you'll see the back of my cloak, or you'll see my footprints." And very often, and this is what Joseph perhaps was maturing into his faith development too. If we were to write God a biography, we would write Joseph a biography, that it seems that Joseph had little room in his own imagination for God as a younger man, and God is clearly absent in these dreams. It's Joseph to whom they're bowing down. It's the heavenly array that's bowing down, that idea. And then as he progresses, such that when he meets up with his brothers, he can say to them, "This was all God's doing. I'm not angry. I'm not upset. I recognize that God's been here all the time." Or right, I see God's footprints, fingerprints. We've used that image before, after the fact. Now, you may go back and say, "Well, all the while, I recognize now that God was with me." You know the story about the footprints. That's when I carried you. All these ideas. But after the fact, going back and putting the pieces back together. And it demonstrates an evolution or maturation of Joseph's relationship with God in perhaps much the same way as we might be able individually to track our own relationship with what God means, or where we discern God, or how much we ascribe to God and how much we believe that I'm self-made, these ideas. And it grows over time, or should ideally change over time.
Any last thoughts? Allison?
I never thought I'd say something good came out of the Holocaust. But before any anti-Semitism and hate was sort of put under the rug, not discussed, it was so powerful. It was such a reminder of what hate looks like that nobody can ever forget it or marginalize it.
And what evil man can do to man.
Yeah.
Evil.
Yeah.
And you know, Hitler's gang, they were all communists. They were all communists, and he elevated them, and they did all these evil things.
People can do evil, but what at least I, and I think Aaron are here, is to help remind us of what it also means to do good. That's what we're trying to talk about and think about. So next class is dismissed, graduation. You can move your tassels whichever way. We will begin in September 8th. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, I'm here. Later.